Okay, folks, what I'd like to do this morning is a coding demonstration of arrays in JavaScript, and what I hope to do is walk through a lot of basic functionality with arrays and some of their useful methods. And so to wire this up, all I have is a empty HTML page, and I'll go ahead and make a new file in Visual Studio called script.js. So I've got an external JavaScript file, and I'll go ahead and use the script tag to link to it, so a script with the source, and go ahead and script.js. And we talked about the benefits of adding the defer attribute to that, and I always like to just kind of do a little test to make sure that everything's wired up properly. And if I launch my page, I should have a console log that says hello world. And so I know that my script is wired up to my HTML and that that's going. Now I'll go ahead and add a use strict, which kind of enforces some rules in JavaScript to kind of enforce good practices. And so that's always a good thing to add to the top of your JavaScript files. Now that we've got that wired up, what are we going to do in this example? Well, so I would like to demonstrate how to create an array, along with basically what arrays are and their benefits. And then once we've created an array, an array is just a way to store a bunch of data. And so if you think about what we learned in the first chapter, is like, hey, we learned these things are variables, and that these variables are created with let or const, and that a variable can store a single piece of data. Well, an array is just a storage unit for a lot of data. And when you have a storage unit for a lot of data, I immediately go to Crud Operations. And so that's what I want to demonstrate today. And what are Crud Operations? Well, anytime you're working with data, you can create new data, you can read from that data, you can update that data, and you can delete that data. And so it doesn't matter like what language you're learning and what is in that language. It's whether you're working with databases or arrays or file IO, it's just always kind of a good demo to do CRUD, because those are your basic operations. So with that, what is an array? We already covered that. How are we going to create it? That's well, real quick. Const keyword, and everything kind of starts off the same. I'll just call it data equals, so far everything's looking the same, but now we've got brackets on the right. And this is just kind of the syntax that I like the best. There are other ways to create an array, but I just like this syntax the best. Now, I can put a name in here, which this is in a string value. And I could put another name, and I can put an integer, and I could put a Boolean value, right? Remember, there's different data types, and it turns out that this is in my particular Visual Studio, it wants me to use single quotes on my strings, and that's fine. And it wants me to have a space. This is just what I have on my code editor. It's called a linter. That's kind of giving me some errors, or more or less suggestions on ways that you should write your code, even though it's not a requirement by JavaScript. JavaScript, you can have single quotes or double quotes for your strings. The suggestion for my linter is single quotes, not a requirement, but just to keep it consistent. Okay, this is how you create an array. The magic is in the brackets. And so what we have here is 4 pieces of information. It's not really relevant information, but we have 4 pieces of data that we're storing. And so, now the benefit, instead of having 4 different variables to store our info, we've got 1 variable that stores a lot of information. And so, you think about a lot of apps, a lot of apps have a lot of data. And so to be able to store a lot of data in a single container, that's really the benefit of an array. And there's actually some performance benefits there as well, where all of the data in an array is stored sequentially in your computer's RAM. And what I mean sequentially is kind of like one address after the other in RAM. Think of it as like you're delivering mail and you're going to go from one house to the next house sequentially, one right after the other. That's a faster way of delivering mail than to have to go from one street and then you go to another street and then drop it off in another neighborhood, and you're kind of moving all around. And that's exactly the same analogy applies in your computer's RAM. If data is stored sequentially in RAM, you can just kind of get the data sequentially one right after the other in RAM and not have to kind of jump around in the memory location of your RAM. So performance benefits to using arrays over, if you got 1,000 pieces of data, storing it in 1,000 different variables, they could be stored in all over your RAM in different neighborhoods, if you will. So that's what an array is. That's the benefits of an array. And so, in our operations, the first thing that makes sense to do is a read operation. And so what I'd like to do is kind of hop back over to my HTML, and I've got a boilerplate template HTML. Of course, I just like incorporating a little bootstrap. And so let me kind of go into the bootstrap docs and include the bootstrap template and kind of just replace this here. And so this has a couple of extra script tags that'll allow us to use Bootstrap CSS and do something simple like div with the class of container fluid, and that way we got a little wrapper going on here, and we can just use some Bootstrap classes. And I'll just go ahead and wire up a form, and in that form we'll just have a Bootstrap button. Button D, oh, button disabled. I was just curious what these different I want a button type of button. It's interesting that that's not in there. And I'm just going to put this to be a read function, button, and we'll get a little Bootstrap class of button, large, and button danger for read. And okay, so we got a little read button, and we'll wire up a little JavaScript so that when we click that button, we're going to perform a read operation. And so again, we're going to do that by document get element by ID. We're going to target our button, which we don't have an ID on this button, so let's just call it button read, btn read. So now we can target that by btn read dot on click, and we're going to do what's called an anonymous arrow function. So it's a function that doesn't have a name and it runs on button click. And I'll do a console.log again just to make sure that the read operation is wired up. and launch this. And so now I get my developer tools and click my button, and I've made a typo. So let's glance at this. Document, get element by ID, button read. Dot on click equals arrow function. Aha, there's a semicolon. Is that going to do it? Good eye. I got good eyes. Silly me, I know exactly what I did. When I replaced the, I didn't link to my script. Okay. Script source, I deleted my link to my script source. Okay, script.js, here we go. Defer. It's Monday, it's not Monday. That's my excuse. Okay, let's bring this back. Console, read operation. Okay, here we go. So we have a button click for our button read, and you know what you could do is like a paragraph tag, and ID of output, and I just want to show if you do document get element by ID, and you target output, and you say dot. And there's a few properties you could do here: inner HTML or inner text. So if you're writing actual HTML, you can use inner HTML. There's also inner text if you're just putting text in there. Equals, and I'm just going to do data just to show what that looks like. And if we kind of load this up, and there you go. And so it kind of does comma separated values of your data. And that's fine to do a read operation. Now, that doesn't really give you access to every piece at a time. Like if you want to show all the data in the array, that's cool. There's other ways to display this data. If you don't want to read all of the data, well, then some more advanced logic is in there where you can say, okay, I'm looking for the name Evan. Does Evan exist in this array? And you'd have to loop through the array, and we'll have to learn loops and learn how to do that. But this is just the quickest, simplest, easy way to do our read operation on click. So one thing that is also worth mentioning at this point, if you've done other languages, if you've studied other languages, your arrays had data types, and so you could only have an array of strings, for example. So you couldn't have kind of like this mixed nature, this mixed bag of data types. But in JavaScript, which is known as a loosely typed language, it's just kind of flexible, and it's not, it doesn't have data types, kind of strict data types, that is. Now, there is a flavor of JavaScript, or what you could call a framework of JavaScript called TypeScript. And TypeScript is JavaScript, but it is a strictly typed JavaScript that has strict data types, right? So just FYI, that might be something we look at in the future, is this TypeScript, because the industry is really adopting types in JavaScript with this framework. Okay. So we have different data types. It's also true that we might not want to read all of our data at once. So, the way that you do that, instead of saying, okay, read all of the data, what if you just want like the first element? To read the first element, and I'm in such a bad habit of closing this every time. I need to keep it open and then just Alt-Tab. Okay. To read just the first piece of data, you use brackets, and so brackets to me scream like array, like this is an array. So when you're creating an array, we've got brackets, and if you want to read a single piece of data, you use the identifier, and then brackets, and then the position of that data in the array. Well, you might notice we start the position at 0, and most modern programming languages start the count at 0, including JavaScript. And so our first piece of data is actually position, or what you would call index 0. So Ellie is at index 0, Evan is index 1, the number 2 is at index, it just happens to be index 2. And true is the fourth piece of data. It's the fourth piece of data at index 3, right? So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, and those are your 4 pieces of data stored in our array. So if I want to, access any, piece of information, data sub 2, and just to make that less confusing, I'll put the number 20 in there. So it's index 2 that stores the number 20. And if I reload the page and read that individual position using its index, or you might also hear that called the subscript, right? So this is data subscript 2 or position 2 or sub 2. Data sub 2 is kind of the quick way of saying that, right? Position 2. This is the basics of how to create an array, how to access data in an array. You can also, let's do an update. And so we talk about, accessing data at number 2. Let's go ahead and do the up. So this is our read operation, right? Read operation. And you can make these CRUD operations in any order. I'm just kind of going with the flow here. I started with read. And the next operation is going to be our update, because that's where my brain took me. And I'll go ahead and make another button. Type of button. Class of button, button large, button warning, update, and ID of btn update. All right, so we've got a button update here. Let's go ahead and make another anonymous arrow function. Document get element by ID, button update, dot on click, equals, parentheses, equals arrow, curlies. Okay, so we'll ask the user, it might be worth just having a label for update first user name. We'll update position 0, which is currently the name Ellie. Label for, and then we'll have an input type of text. ID is text update. So label for text update. And okay, well, might as well put a little line break in here to kind of do that. If we wanted to get a little bootstrap, grid going on here, make it look a little better, that's simple enough. In fact, not the purpose of this, but if we add class of row, class of form label, class of form control, and we'll make a div with a class of call -3. Let's try it like this. Div class call -3 times 4. So this is, you know, 3, 3, 3, and 3 adds up to 12. And each one of these is 1/4 of 12. And so maybe here we'll put our label and our text box. And then just glance at that. Okay, that's really not the point here, but div, do the same thing, div class call -3 times 4, we'll get 4 more. Here we'll put the update button, and this button, and format it, control, format, I forgot my hotkey. Beautify. I don't like that. Let's do this. Okay. This is, I'm happy with this. Far from perfect. Update user first name. This has nothing to do with the JavaScript. And we got at least rows and columns going on now. And this is, you know, in the same column. And so the idea here is I'm going to type in Billy and update that position 0. And so now that we have the update wired up, I'll do a console.log update. And console log update. Okay, we can click update and see that that runs. We're still reading, and it's reading the position with 20 in it, number 2. So let's just take that out so we can read all the data again. And instead of just saying the word update, we'll say data sub-0 equals, and we need to read out of the text box. So to read out of the text box, we'll say document.get element by ID, text update. Remember, it's a .value. Whoops, it always does that to me. .value. And so remember, when we're putting something into like a paragraph, we're going to use inner text. But when you're putting something into a text box, you use value. So there's different properties for different elements of HTML. Value for text boxes, inner text for like paragraphs and things of that nature that have like lists and headings and all this stuff has inner text. So if we run update, this should read out of the text box, put it into data 0, and then we'll click on read after that. And so now probably you want to give some notification that the user's been updated, but you can see here when I read, it does put John in position 0. And so the only thing probably that you could add to that would just be a little alert that the user has been updated. That way they get some sort of like feedback on the screen. User 0 updated, then we click read, and there we go. So we've demonstrated updating, we've demonstrated reading. Let's do create.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
All right, so instead of just outputting it and to where it's just kind of like just the text is just kind of floating there, can you output it to like a text box?
Absolutely, yeah. So here I used inner text of a paragraph. But if I wanted to output it to a text box, I would need the output. I would need that control on here first off. I'd need its ID. And then I would put the dot value equal to data, right? And it would work the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to see that, or do you believe me?
No, I believe you.
Right on. Yeah. You would just the thing about putting it into a text box is that would let the user, unless it's a disabled text box, it would let the user kind of delete it and mess with it. But maybe that's what you want. Hard to say. So let's do a create, and here now we've got our buttons inside of here. So I'll do a button. Whatever, button small, button hyphen success. And this will be the first method that we use to add new data, like create a new user, right? Document.get element by ID. Did I wire up a ID? Sure didn't. ID is button create. Dot on click equals parentheses arrow. Okay, so this is our third column. So I'll add some controls here. Label, create new user, input, type of text, ID is text create, label for text create, class is form label, class is form control. Take a look at this. Okay, I'll make the button large. There's no reason I made it small other than, I don't know. No reason. Just looking at it. Button large. And let's do a console.log created. Maybe. See, this isn't going to... You guys, on the end, how's this look? Would you prefer the full screen?
I think so. That looks a little crap.
Yeah, I would rather.
Alt-tab. I just got to... It's on me. I got to remember to Alt-tab. Okay, full screen. There are semicolons that I forgot here and here. I did that earlier too. Okay. And here, console, created. So we're doing good. Don't close it. Okay, so to create, we're going to do... so notice here, I just read right out of the text box and stored it in updated position 0. And so we can do the same thing, or you can read it out of the text box and store it in a variable and then work with that variable. I'll do both. So I'll start with the variable, and you could tell me which way you like better. So I'll say const new user equals document.get element by ID text create dot value. And now we're going to add that to the end of the array. Now it turns out there are a lot of methods that you can use, and to add a method to add to the end is the push. So there's a method called push, and we'll use this method to put this new user at the end of our array. So our array is called data, and you notice push. And so push has some syntax there that you can read into that what that means. But basically, what I'm going to do is put new user right here. And so the idea is we read from the text box, we put it into a variable, and then we push that variable to the end of our array. So it's going to be, the new user is going to be in the, well, it's the 5th piece of data, or the subscript would be 0, right? Because it starts at 0, did I say 0? Subscript 4. The count starts at 0. But new user would be subscript 4 because it's the 5th piece of data. So anyways, let's give the little user an alert that user created, and then we'll read them to make sure. So Sam create, user created, and if we click read, we can see that Sam's added to the end. So to add a new piece of information into an array, you can use what's called push. Alternatively, there's a method that I'll come back to this, because there's another way to add an element, not to the end, but somewhere else. Anywhere else in the array. If you don't want to put it at the end, you could put it at, wherever you want it. What's the last operation? Delete. Okay, just pause there for a minute. Delete, right? So we need a delete button. Of course, my delete has to be red. There are various ways to delete with JavaScript, and it just depends on what you're trying to delete. Do you want to delete the first element, the last element? Or in a certain position. And so that's kind of, there's different methods for doing that. Let's go ahead and wire this up. Document, get element by ID. Button delete. Okay, so we got our delete wired up. The easy method is called pop, and if push puts it at the end, pop removes it from the end, right? So I'll go ahead and demonstrate pop, which push adds an element to the end of the array, and pop removes from the end of the array. So these are like the easiest ones. And we don't really need to have any text box because we just know that it's just going to remove from the end, and we should give the user a little alert. User deleted, or well, it's the value of true that'll be deleted, at least by default. So we'll say data deleted. Okay, so we say delete. We got the notification here and in the console because they're both in there. Now if I click on read, you can see push and pop. Those are the two kind kind of easy methods because they just work with the data at the end. If we want to get more complicated and we want to remove from a position, let's do that, and we need to, in our last column, ask the user input type of number, label for, ID of text, position. So we're going to have a text box where the user can type a number, and we're going to ask for a position to delete, like 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And maybe we should make this a drop-down list, or that might make a little bit more sense. So a select with some options. Option times 3, 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3. I always use drop-down list index. Drop-down list index. So this is representing the index to delete. Or I'll say drop-down list delete. That's better. Drop-down list delete. Drop-down list delete for the name and the ID, and there. Okay, so we can select that, and so now when we click delete, the first thing that we need to do is read from our drop-down list in the JavaScript. So how are we going to do that? So I'll store it in a variable. Oh, I forgot to say I'll show both ways. Right here it's creating in a variable, and then here we push it. I'm just backtracking. Check this out. Right? We could just delete that, take the value out of the text box, paste it right there, and then we don't need a semicolon, and voila, right? So we just do data.push, and then we just read the value out of it. So with that method, I mean, which do you prefer? Do you prefer the 2 lines or the 1 line?
I prefer to do a variable, just because then once that data is stored in that variable, I can just visually see it instead of just, assuming that it's in that textbook.
Yeah, you prefer, yeah. I think so. I think that's pretty easy to read and follow that flow. Okay, back to the delete. The first thing we need to do is read the position to delete from the drop-down list. Okay, so into a variable, right? So just like before, constant position equals document.get element by ID, and this was called drop-down list delete, and the dot value, and the values are here, 0, 1, 2, and 3. We literally coded them. Now just to double check my work, I would like to do console.log the position. So not in quotes, outside of quotes, right? Because if you put it in quotes, it's just going to put it, it's just going to read the word position instead of the value that's in there. So let's go here, console, and if I select the number 2, notice I click delete, it just printed 2 to the console. So I read it into a variable, I printed that variable to the console, and it's reading from my drop-down list value. Right? So that's working as intended. So now I've got this position stored. The method, instead of pop and push, is slice. So to delete from a position, we're going to use Slice. Data is our array. Dot slice, and you specify a couple of things inside of Slice. The position, which we have stored, and the number of elements to delete. And so if I do position and I say delete 1. Okay, now I could say start at this position and delete 2, or start at this position and delete 3, but basically I'm going to say start at position 0 and delete 1, which means delete 0, or start at position 1 and delete 1, start at position 2 and delete 1. I'm not sure that this 1 is, that might be assumed, that might be default, but I'm just demonstrating as if it's not. And so let's delete position 2, and position 2 was our number, right? Position 2, I didn't mean to have that open. If I go back to our data here, position 2, this is 0, this is 1, and 2. So we're going to delete the number 20. And so open up my console, position 2, and click on delete. I need to give some user feedback, but if I click read, it didn't work. So let's pause and take a quick look. Moving so fast, there is a difference between slice and splice, which was my mistake. We'll cover slice at a later time. Splice, delete at a position. How many elements do you want to delete? So again, the inside of the methods work just that way. What position do you want to start removing? In this case, it's coming from the drop-down list. And how many elements do you want to delete? And now, let me refresh and close, refresh. And if I say 2, deleted, haha. Okay. That's what trying to move as fast as you can, you're going to make little logic errors, and that's exactly what that was. Okay. Turns out the same method, the splice method, can be used to create a new user at a certain position. And so that will be next. Okay, let's jump into the code. And if our update, well, let's see. Create was our third column, and so I'm going to add a little drop-down list next to it. Create user, select option times 4. Zero, 1, 2, 3, 0, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so we're going to create. The first thing we need to do is read our variable. Const position equals okay, read the position, read the text box, and we're going to use data.splice, and we'll say position. We want to insert at this position. You put 0 for the delete count. So the delete count is 0. So it makes it an insert at that point. And then the new user is the data that we want to insert. So the splice method takes 3 arguments here. The first is the position to put it in. The 0 just means, hey, this is not, we don't want to delete anything. Just like it was here, we want to delete one thing. Here we're saying we don't want to delete anything. And then new user. Right, so that should, so if we, again, we can look at our data, like let's just insert in position 2, right? So that will shift my name over. It'll go Ellie first and then the new user and then Evan. So we'll select, well, it's the second piece of data or position 1. So we're going to select 1 out of our drop-down list. And we said Sam, create, user created. And if I read, there you can see Ellie, Sam, Evan, 20, and true. That's CRUD. That's the basics of arrays. And that's the end of that demo. Questions, guys, before I cut off the recording?
No, I'm good.
All right.